join me in welcoming David Swanson. David is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is director of World Beyond War and campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. The U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation awarded him their 2018 Peace Prize, and he has been nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. I think we can conclude that he is well qualified to talk to us about peacemaking.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm honored. I'm reminded of lots of happy memories of Herndon High School class of '87. But if there was encouragement way back then to take on the sorts of projects that our honorees today have taken on, I missed it. I suspect that some improvements have been made in high school education since my day. In fact, after the remarks we've already heard, I am certain of it. And awarding students for leading walkouts from their schools is particularly impressive to me. Can you hear me okay if I don't hold the microphone?
No, lift it up. Lift it up.
How about if I stand really close to it?
Yeah. That's good.
Okay. Sorry, I'm too lazy to hold the thing. So I did manage to learn a lot at Herndon, including by participating in a trip abroad with one of my teachers and from spending a year abroad as an exchange student following graduation prior to starting college. Seeing the world through a new culture and language helped me to question things that I hadn't. I believe we need a lot more questioning, including of things that are familiar and comfortable. The students being honored today have all been willing to push themselves beyond what was comfortable. And you all don't need me to tell you that there are benefits from having done that way beyond an award. In the summaries of what these students have done, I see a lot of working to oppose bigotry, of recognizing humanity in those who are different, helping others to be able to do the same. I see a lot of opposing cruelty and violence and advocating nonviolent solutions and kindness. I think of all these steps as part of building a culture of peace, although I also very much like the phrase a caring culture that I heard earlier today. By peace, I mean not exclusively, but first and foremost, the absence of wars. Prejudice is a wonderful tool in marketing wars. Human understanding is a wonderful impediment to marketing wars. But we have to also avoid allowing ourselves to have our concerns used against us. We have to avoid accepting that the only way to solve some alleged crime in some distant place is to commit the larger crime of war. And we have to figure out how to persuade governments to behave as peacefully on a large scale as we try to do on a smaller scale, so that we aren't welcoming refugees while our government causes more people to flee their homes, so that we aren't sending aid to places while our government sends missiles and guns. I recently did a couple of public debates with a professor from the U.S. Army's West Point Academy. The question was whether war can ever be justified. He argued yes, I argued no. Like many people who argue his side, he spent a fair amount of time talking not about wars, but about finding yourself confronted in a dark alleyway. The idea being that everyone must simply agree that they would be violent if confronted in a dark alleyway, and therefore wars can be justified. I responded by asking him not to change the subject, and by claiming that what one person does in a dark alleyway, whether violent or not, has very little in common with the collective enterprise of constructing massive equipment, of organizing massive forces, of making the calm and deliberate choice to drop explosives on distant people's homes, rather than negotiate or cooperate or make use of courts or arbitration or aid or disarmament agreements. But if you have read, and if you haven't, I hope you will, this excellent book that's being given to these outstanding students today, Sweet Fruit from a Bitter Tree, then you will know that it simply is not true that a person alone in a dark alleyway never has any better options than violence. For some people, in some cases, in dark alleyways and other similar locations, violence could prove to be the best option, a fact that would tell us absolutely nothing about the institution of war. But in this book, we read numerous stories, and there are no doubt many, no doubt millions more just like them, of people who chose a different course. It sounds not just uncomfortable, but ridiculous to the dominant culture we live in to suggest starting a conversation with a would-be rapist, making friends with burglars, asking an attacker about his troubles, or inviting him to dinner. How can such an approach, documented to have worked over and over again in practice, ever be made to work in theory? If anyone here is planning on attending college, you will hear just that question quite often. Well, here's a different theory. Very often, not always, but very often, people have a need for respect and friendship that is much stronger than their desire to inflict pain. A friend of mine named David Hartsoe was part of a nonviolent action in Arlington, trying to integrate a segregated lunch counter. And an angry man put a knife up to him and threatened to kill him. David calmly looked him in the eye and said words to this effect: "You do what you think you have to do, my brother, but I'm going to love you anyway." And the hand holding the knife started to shake, and the knife fell to the floor, and also the lunch counter was integrated. Humans are a very peculiar species. We don't actually need a knife to the throat to start feeling uncomfortable. I may say things in a speech like this one that don't threaten anyone in any way, but nonetheless make some people pretty darn uncomfortable. I wish they didn't, but I think they have to be said even if they do. A little over a year ago, as we've already heard today, there was a mass shooting at a high school in Florida. Many people have, quite rightly I think, asked the people just up the road here at the NRA to consider what role their corruption of government may play in the endless epidemic of gun violence in the United States. Thank you, by the way, to Congressman Connolly for having just voted for background checks. But almost nobody mentions that our tax dollars paid to train that young man in Florida to kill, trained him right in the cafeteria at the high school where he did it, and that he was wearing a t-shirt advertising that training program when he murdered his classmates. Why wouldn't that upset us? Why wouldn't we all feel some responsibility? Why would we avoid the subject? One possible explanation is that we've been taught that when the U.S. Army trains people to shoot guns, it's for a good purpose. Not murder, but some other kind of shooting people. And that a t-shirt from a JROTC program is an admirable, patriotic, and noble badge of honor that we shouldn't disgrace by mentioning it in conjunction with a mass murder of people who matter. After all, Fairfax County has the JROTC too, and hasn't experienced the same result as Parkland, Florida, yet. Questioning the wisdom of such programs would be vaguely unpatriotic, perhaps even treasonous. It is more comfortable just to keep quiet. Now let me say something even more uncomfortable. Mass shooters in the United States, very disproportionately, have been trained by the U.S. military. That is to say, veterans are proportionately much more likely to be mass shooters than are a random group of men of the same age. The facts in this regard are not in dispute, only the acceptability of mentioning them. It's all right to point out that mass shooters are almost all male. It's all right to point out how many suffer from mental illness, but not how many were trained by one of the biggest public programs the world has ever seen. Needless to say, or rather I wish it were needless to say, one doesn't mention mental illness in order to encourage cruelty to the mentally ill, or veterans in order to condone anyone being mean to veterans. I mention the suffering of veterans and the suffering that some of them sometimes inflict on others in order to open up a conversation about whether we ought to stop creating more veterans going forward. In Fairfax County, as much as anywhere in this country, questioning militarism is questioning an existing economy of military contractors. Studies have found that if you moved money from military spending to education, or infrastructure, or green energy, or even tax cuts for working people, you would have so many more jobs, and better paying jobs at that you could in fact divert sufficient funds into aiding anybody who needed help in the transition from a military job to a non-military job. But in our current culture, people think of the enterprise of mass killing as a jobs program, and investment in it as normal. When the Guantanamo base in Cuba became known for having tortured people to death, someone asked Starbucks why they chose to have a coffee shop at Guantanamo. And the response was that choosing not to have one there would amount to a political statement, whereas having one there was just normal. In Congressman Jerry Connolly's last campaign, the political action committees of at least 9 big weapons companies chipped in $10,000 each. Normal. In Charlottesville, we've just asked our city council to adopt a policy of no longer investing in weapons or fossil fuels. A quick glance at a few websites shows me that Fairfax County, too, invests retirement funds, for example, in such life-threatening enterprises as ExxonMobil. And in state of Virginia, investments in funds that invest heavily in weapons. I think of some of my wonderful teachers at Herndon High School and wonder whether they would have appreciated someone making their retirement dependent on the flourishing of the war business and the destruction of the Earth's climate through fossil fuel use. I also wonder whether anyone asked them. In fact, I'm absolutely certain nobody did. But does anyone ever ask us the most important questions that we need to just go ahead and answer anyway? I remember history classes in school. This may have changed, but this is what I remember, focusing very heavily on U.S. history. And the United States, I learned, was very special in a great many ways. And it took me quite a while to figure out that in most of those ways, the United States was not actually very special. Before I learned that, and it may be that this was necessary, that this come first, I learned to identify myself with humanity. I generally think of myself as a member of lots of different small groups, residents of Charlottesville, Herndon High School class of '87, many others, but most importantly, I think of myself as a member of the group called humanity, whether humanity likes it or not. So I'm proud of us when the U.S. government or some other U.S. resident does something good, and also when any other government or person does anything good. And I'm ashamed by failures everywhere, equally. The net result of identifying as a world citizen is often quite positive, by the way. Thinking in those terms may make it easier, not only to examine ways in which the United States is not so special, such as its lack of a health coverage system to measure up to what other countries have got working in practice, even though our professors tell us it could never work in theory, but also easier to examine the ways in which the United States is indeed a very special outlier. Some weeks from now, when the University of Virginia men's basketball team wins the NCAA championship, viewers will hear, you heard it here first, viewers will hear the announcers thank their troops from watching from 175 countries. You will not hear anything of the sort anywhere else on Earth. The United States has some 800 to 1,000 major military bases in some 80 countries that are not the United States. The rest of the world's nations combined have a couple of dozen bases outside their borders. The United States spends almost as much on wars and preparations for wars as the rest of the world combined. And much of the rest of the world is U.S. allies, and much of the spending is on U.S.-made weapons, which are not infrequently found on both sides of wars. U.S. military spending is some 60%, this is across numerous agencies and departments, some 60% of the spending that Congress decides on each year. U.S. weapons exports are #1 in the world. The U.S. government arms the vast majority of the world's dictatorships by its own definition. When people are outraged that Donald Trump speaks with a North Korean dictator, I'm actually relieved, because the typical relationship is to arm and train the forces of dictators. Very few people in the United States can name all of the countries that their country has bombed in the current year, and that has been true for many years. In a presidential primary debate last time around, a moderator asked a candidate if he would be willing to kill hundreds and thousands of innocent children as part of his basic presidential duties. I do not think you will find a similar question in an electoral debate in any other country. I think it suggests a normalization of something that never should have been accepted, even in rare circumstances. Chapter 51 of Sweet Fruit from the Bitter Tree describes a U.S. military operation in Iraq that managed to avoid violence on a particular day. What is not mentioned is that this advanced a catastrophic occupation that devastated a nation and led to the development of groups like ISIS. On page 212, the U.S. military commander who's recounting the incident remarks how horrible it is to kill another human being at close range. Quote, "I would shoot all the artillery," he writes, "drop all the Air Force's bombs and strafe the enemy with the division's attack helicopters before I would see one of my young soldiers in a street fight with the enemy at close quarters." End quote. This sounds like, and maybe it is, kindness. It sounds like humaneness. He wants to spare his young soldiers the horror and the moral injury of killing at close range. But here's the catch. Aerial attacks usually kill and injure and traumatize and render homeless overwhelmingly civilians, by which I do not mean to accept the killing of the non-civilian so-called enemy, and they do so in much larger numbers than ground attacks. The more the United States or anywhere else wages its wars from the air, the more people die. The more the dying is one-sided, and the less any of it makes the news back home. Perhaps those facts are not all decisive for everyone, but their absence from such accounts is best explained, I think, by the accepted idea that some lives matter and some lives do not matter, or at least matter much less. The case that we make at an organization I work for called World Beyond War is that if everybody matters, war can never be justified at all. 3% of U.S. military spending could end starvation on the planet. A slightly bigger slice could put up an undreamed of attempt to slow down climate collapse, to which militarism is an unheralded major contributor. War kills most not with any weapon, but through the diversion of funding away from where it's needed. War kills and injures directly on a major scale, erodes our liberties in the name of freedom, risks nuclear apocalypse for reasons that make any arguments my friends and I had back in high school seem mature and practically saintly by comparison, poisons our culture with xenophobia and racism, and militarizes our police, our entertainment, our history books, and our minds. If some future war could plausibly be marketed as likely to do more good than harm, which it cannot, it would also have to do enough good to outweigh all the harm of keeping the institution of war around, plus the harm of all the various wars thereby generated. Ending militarism could be done by stages, but even getting people to the point of working on it usually requires getting past the #1 topic of U.S. history and entertainment, answering a question that we can probably all recite in unison. It's just 3 words. What about Hitler? A few months ago, I spoke at a high school in D.C. As I often do, I told them I'd perform a magic trick. I only know one, but I know it will almost always work with no skill required. I scribbled on a piece of paper and folded it up, and I asked someone to name a war that was justified. They, of course, said World War II. I, of course, opened up the piece of paper, which said World War II. Magic. I could do a second part with equal reliability. I ask why, they say the Holocaust. I could do a third part as well. I ask, what does Evian mean? They say, I don't know, or bottled water. Of the many times that I've done this, only once that I recall did someone say anything other than World War II. And only once did someone know what Evian meant. Otherwise, it has never failed. You can try it at home, be a magician without learning any sleight of hand. Evian was the location of the biggest, most famous of the conferences at which the nations of the world got together and decided not to accept Jews from Germany. This is not secret knowledge. This is history that's been out in the open from the day it occurred, massively covered by the major world media at the time, discussed in endless papers and books since the time. When I asked why the nations of the world refused Jewish refugees, the blank stares continue. I have to actually explain that they refused to accept them for openly racist, anti-Semitic reasons, expressed without shame or embarrassment. That no World War II posters read, "Uncle Sam wants you to save the Jews." If there had been a day on which the US government decided to save the Jews, it would be one of our biggest holidays on our calendar, but it never happened. Preventing the horror of the camps did not become a justification for the war until after the war. The US and British governments right through the war refused all demands to evacuate those threatened on the grounds that they were too busy fighting the war. A war that killed many, many more times the people that were killed in the camps. There are, of course, more fact-based defenses of World War II, and I could do my best to try to reply to each one if we had another several weeks, and I didn't need to wrap this up. But isn't it odd that one of the main public projects of the US government is almost always defended by reference to an example of its use 75 years ago, in a world with radically different systems of law, with no nuclear weapons, with brutal colonization by European powers, and with little understanding of the techniques of nonviolent action? Is there anything else we do that we justify by reference to the 1940s? If we modeled our high schools on those of the 1940s, we would be considered backward indeed. Why should our foreign policy not have the same standards? In 1973, Congress created a means for any Congress member to force a vote on ending a war. This past December, the Senate used it for the very first time to vote to end US participation in the war on Yemen, which we heard about earlier. And earlier this year, the House did the same, but added in some unrelated language that the Senate refused to vote on, so now both houses have to vote again, maybe this week. And if they do, and we should all insist that they do, what is to stop them from ending another war, and another war, and another war, until they haven't got any left? That's something to work for. Thank you. Peace.